Now to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. He's been warning that Russia is planning a serious escalation of its war against his country. He was addressing the United Nations General Assembly. Mr. Zelensky said that the Russian leader Vladimir Putin is planning to attack nuclear power plants in Ukraine.
Recently, I received yet another alarming report from our intelligence. Now Putin does seem to be planning attacks on our nuclear power plants and their infrastructure, aiming to disconnect the plants from the power grid. With the help of satellites, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, satellites of other countries. Russia is getting images and detailed information about the infrastructure of our nuclear power plants. But what does this really threaten? Any missile or drone strike, any critical incident in the energy system could lead to a nuclear disaster. A day like that must never come. And Moscow needs to understand this, and this depends in part on your determination to put pressure on the aggressor. These are nuclear power plants. They must be safe.
Volodymyr Zelensky there addressing the UN General Assembly. My colleague Sumi Samaskanda is in New York for us. And Sumi, you are monitoring that speech that happened within the past hour or so.
That's right. It was really a stark message to delegates, to world leaders who were gathered here in New York. President Zelensky making very clear that this is not just about Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, but rather about how this conflict could be brought to the rest of the world. That's why he raised that point about nuclear plant safety. But I want to bring in our North America correspondent, Neda Tawfik, because she was also listening into the speech and has been speaking to delegates and people across the conference over the last few days. And Neda, it was interesting, especially to hear President Zelensky had this pointed message for the global South. Tell us more about what he said there.
Yeah, well, look, we heard it in speeches from Brazil's President Lula yesterday, talking about this six-point peace plan that China and Brazil have come up with. And that peace plan Ukraine has already described as destructive because it doesn't require Russia to withdraw before direct negotiations take place. And President Lula on Friday is going to be talking to others in the global South about this peace plan. So it was interesting to see President Volodymyr Zelensky, who is, of course, here in New York, trying to push this idea that Ukraine has to be coming from a place of strength to force President Putin to the negotiating table. And so he directly criticized China and Brazil, saying he's questioned what their intentions were and that these, what he called half-hearted settlement plans, were just forsaking essentially Ukrainian interests and giving President Putin the political space to continue his war. And he said that Ukrainians wouldn't kind of sacrifice their future essentially for others to gain more power.
Yeah, very interesting how he talked about these alternate peace plans that cannot be listened to. And, you know, this is all not a part of a larger visit for President Zelensky here in the U.S., where he's going to be heading to the White House to meet with President Biden. A lot of talk about this plan for victory that will be presented. Tell us more about this diplomatic push that we're seeing from President Zelensky.
He's going to be unveiling that victory plan after he presents it to Joe Biden. We know he's really keen as well to meet with the candidates for the U.S. election. Kamala Harris, still a big question mark if he will meet President Trump. Some reports that has been actually canceled because of some remarks he's given to the press about just saying essentially that President Trump doesn't quite know how difficult it will be to end the war, nudging on President Trump's comments that if he was elected, he would end the war in Ukraine in a day. But for President Volodymyr Zelensky, it really is about just getting the world united around his plan, not wanting any alternatives to be discussed. So he, for example, has spoken at a Security Council high-level meeting. He's spoken today in the General Assembly, but he said that he's held meetings with leaders from Germany, from Japan, all over the world, he says, India as well, to really push for what he calls a just peace. And there's a lot at stake, certainly, for Ukraine, obviously. But when you look at kind of upcoming winter, he raised the issue of how things could get more difficult for his country, and he claimed that Russia is even planning attacks on their nuclear facilities.
Yeah, that's exactly what he said in his speech to the delegates. And, you know, one more point that we keep hearing is that President Zelensky will push again to be able to use Western long-range missiles into Russian territory? I mean, that's something we can anticipate will be discussed specifically with President Biden.
Yeah, and it's specifically because of that threat, he says, of Russia wanting to target Ukraine's nuclear facilities and how devastating that would be on Ukraine's ability to carry out the war. He says it is necessary for Ukraine to go on the military offensive. He says that's part of his victory plan. They've already had an incursion into Kursk. He says that shows that the Ukrainian spirit won't be broken. But there is that key demand from Western allies to be able to use long-range missiles to hit inside Russia. Now, President Biden hasn't committed to that. Western leaders haven't committed to that because of President Putin saying that he would see that as direct involvement by NATO in the conflict. So that will certainly be a topic I'm sure he will be bringing up with President Biden.
All right, Neda, thank you so much. We'll certainly be following all of President Zelensky's movements here at the United Nations headquarters in New York. But as Neda said, this is in a very critical week for President Zelensky as he essentially is closing ranks behind his efforts to get more support for Ukraine as the country heads into this long winter and with that very big unknown of the U.S. presidential election coming up. So with that, we'll hand back to you in London.
Sumi, as always, many thanks. Yeah, a critical week there. Our thanks to Sumi Somaskanda and Neda Tawfiq there at the UN. Lots to pick up on this. Well, let's cross over straight away to Warsaw. We can talk to Mika Baranovski, Managing Director of the German Marshall Fund East, the US political policy think tank. Welcome, sir. What do you make of what we heard at the UN General Assembly from Volodymyr Zelensky, because he immediately invoked what happened in Chernobyl. He was talking about the possibility of Russia attacking nuclear power stations. A stark warning for the international community.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a real danger. We are talking about it here in Poland. This would be a catastrophe that impacts not only Ukraine, but also neighboring countries, including Russia, by the way. And President Zelensky was right to pressure the international community to do something about this real danger. And also, he made a case about bringing Russia to the table. But really, at this point, it's President Putin that has to be forced to come to the table, because Russia is just continuing attacking both the border regions, but also civilian populations in Ukraine. So he's asking for the world to finally act.
So he's asking for the world to finally act. Is that why he's not asking for permission to use those long-range missiles into Russian territory? Is he balancing what he's asking for and trying to keep the international community on his side?
That request will come. That request is specifically to President Biden. It's really for his one-on-one meeting, and I hope that there will be a movement in American position. The reason why Ukrainians need the ability to strike deeper inside Russia is to be able to reach the airports from which the flights take off to bombard Ukrainian cities and potentially destroy Ukrainian power plants as well, including damaging nuclear power plants. So it's really a request to be able to defend itself in much more effective way. But that's a conversation specifically with President Biden, who right now is not allowing for this to go forward, including ability to use, for example, British weapons that Ukraine already has.
So a question for President Biden, possibly a question also going forward when there is a new president in the White House. How does Volodymyr Zelensky future-proof his victory plan for whoever takes over the Oval Office?
I don't think there is a way to future-proof the relations between US and Ukraine. That's why it's so critical for President Zelensky to also meet with former President Trump. He's meeting with candidate and Vice President Kamala Harris. What he can do and what he's asking President Biden to do is to move forward in support of Ukraine, precisely specifically when it comes to extending range of weapons. And there will be also request to buttress the security guarantees from the United States to Ukraine, so a peace can be reached with Russia, but from a just position, from a position of strength. Now, the next president of the United States can turn it all around. That's why I don't think that what President Zelensky can get in this trip is a resolution of this.
He'll need to be quick to get whatever it is that he needs. He needs to be quick because he's meeting President Biden tomorrow. Mika Baranovski from the German Marshall Fund East, thank you so much for joining us on BBC News.